Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Index Engineering. In today's episode, we're going to be taking this 5.3 out of an 09 Avalanche, and we're going to be tearing it down, and we're going to be rebuilding it. I hope you guys enjoy. So the first thing that we're going to do with this engine is we're going to start by taking off the valve covers, and those are a 8mm socket. So we'll set the valve covers off to the side. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to drain the oil from the engine. We actually probably could have done this step first, but I wasn't sure if there was actually any oil in it or not. So once that's drained, then we'll work on to the next process. The next thing that we're going to do is remove all the bolts holding the rockers down, and then we'll set those off to the side and get those ready to go in the UltraSonic cleaner. At the same time that we do those, we're also going to do the push rods, so we can pull those out and get those put in the basket as well. You can see how dirty that those rockers are, and they should come out looking almost like new. Same with the push rods. Now that we got those done, we're going to go through and work on pulling off the exhaust manifolds. Those are a 13mm on this engine, but on some of the older ones, those are still a 10mm. So you just got to check and see which version, if you got a Gen 3 or a Gen 4, and then you'll know which one to use. Now with the exhaust manifold off, I can go through and start pulling the heads off the engine. We're going to start with the 10 mils on the top of the engine, on the top of each head, and then we'll go through and start pulling all the 15 mils inside the heads. Now you keep seeing me go over to the bench. I have a couple of plastic containers that I use to keep track of all the bolts and where they're at.
I'm walking alone, the streets are empty. The only thing I can see is my own silhouette. I'm getting stronger, step by step. The clock is ticking, but there's no time for regrets. I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe trying to protect your soul. We are heroes tonight.
So the biggest issue with this engine was that it had the active fuel management lifters, and the cylinder 1 lifters went out. So the main purpose on this one was not just to fix those lifters, but to fix the primary problem that was causing the lifter failure. So we wanted to do new oil pump, new main bearings, and since we had it tore down that far, we decided to do new piston rings and to hone the cylinders as well. Now we'll start working on removing the valley cover, which has all of the channels in it for the active fuel management to actually work. You can tell the difference between this and a non-active fuel management one because all of the ridges on the valley cover will be gone. A non-active fuel management one will be smooth, whereas this one has ridges in it for the oil channels. And that's what it looks like on the bottom side. Next, we're going to work on pulling off all the bolts from the bottom of the oil pan, which is just a standard 10 mil. Once we have all these done, then we can take the oil pan off the engine. And now we're taking off the engine mounting brackets. And here's me getting the camera to do all the video footage that is missing. Next thing that we're doing is pulling all the nuts that hold the windage tray on. And then we'll go through and we'll pull the one bolt that is on the pickup tube out. More footage that's missing. And you can see that the O-ring is kind of crushed, which could be causing some of the issues with it not having high oil pressure once the oil heated up. You can see how disgusting that looks. Next thing that we're going to do is pull all of the bolts from the front cover. That way we can get the timing chain and gear and cam out, because we're going to be replacing the timing chain on this engine with a new one. We're also going to be replacing the oil pump as well. I'm not sure how many miles this one has on it, but I think it's closer to like 180,000 miles. So we're going to take the 4 bolts out that hold that old oil pump in, toss that thing in the trash, and get our new one. Now that we got the engine tore down this far, the UltraSonic Cleaner has just finished cleaning our rockers and push rods, and they look almost like new. Next thing that we're going to work on is pulling all of the bolts out of the main caps, which is a 15mm and a 13mm. And you also have the 10mm that's on the side of the block, since these are 6-bolt mains. The back cover also has to be taken off the engine in order to get the last cap off, because there's a little lip that goes over the top of the last cap. So if you want to pull that last one out, you have to spend the time and pull the back cover off the engine. After working for a few minutes to try and get the caps off, which were pretty much stuck in place from all the old oil that was burnt on them, finally able to get those out after hitting it with a dead blow. And all of the bearings didn't actually look bad. There wasn't really any grooves in them. It didn't look like any of them were super worn. But we decided to replace those anyways. Now that we're getting the last cap out, the next thing that we're going to work on doing is pulling all of the rods out of the engine. That way we can work on getting the crank actually pulled from the block. Rod bearings all looked good as well, but just to be safe, we got new rod bearings for them as well. The oil rings on these pistons actually weren't that bad. The typical LS engines that I've done before, the oil ring on them is generally all plugged and filled up, and these ones weren't that bad considering how nasty the inside of the engine was compared to the other engines I've worked on. So the other thing that I'm doing as I'm going through and pulling the pistons is I'm pulling the rings out of them. We're going to be replacing the rings in each of them, but we're also going to be putting each of the pistons in the UltraSonic cleaner to get them as clean as possible. So originally I thought that I could fit all 8 pistons in the basket at once, but I guess that's not the case. So I decided to split it up into 2 separate loads. That way I can clean 4 of the pistons at a time, and after pulling the rings they should come out looking almost like new. Alright, done getting the rings out, putting the pistons in the UltraSonic cleaner, and now we can work on removing the bolt off the front of the cam, and that way we can pull the timing chain off and then pull the crank out. So you can take a look at this timing gear and just see how dirty it is, and we're going to put that through the UltraSonic cleaner as well so you can see what kind of a job that does. Alright, just got the crank removed. Now we can check out the main bearings. Those are all going to get replaced as well. We're just going to tap those a little bit to get them slid, and that way we can get them pulled out. Next thing that we're doing is removing the 4 bolts from the cam retention plate. This plate has a seal on the back side of it, which if it wears out can cause oil pressure issues. So we are replacing that with a new one, so that one can just go in the trash. Now we can work on getting the cam pulled, and that's the last main thing we need to remove from the block before we go through and start the rebuild process. There we have it. Block is completely torn down and we can work on cleaning, honing, and reassembling.
This is the second set of pistons. So here's the cam gear. Remember what that looked like before. Now, nice and clean. So the only thing with these pistons, after you do them a couple times, doesn't quite get everything off of them. Sometimes you just gotta take a rag and wiping the last little bit of crud off these things, but compared to how these things look to how they look now, I'll take it. So here's the look of everything after it came out of the UltraSonic cleaner. You can see all these cleaned up real good. Same with the pistons. This came out pretty good. These were the second set. You can see the water was pretty dirty by that point, so it didn't get them perfectly clean. Still way better than what they were. So we're going to go through and work on getting these put back in the engine. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to run the berry brush down here to scuff up these cylinders. You can see those things are pretty stinking shiny, so it's got a decent amount of wear on them. So we're going to scuff those up on all these cylinders. And then we're going to go through and start reassembling. Go through and check the gap on the new rings. So we start by putting the piston in there, putting the ring in there, push it down with the piston so that it's square. We're going to measure the gap on it and see what the gap says. You can either go with a 15 or a 16. Check this and see what it says. 15, 16, actually a little bit bigger than 16. What it's gap to. $19 it is. Alright, so we'll just go through and check these as we're doing them, and get them all put in. So after getting the heads cleaned up, pistons in, crank in, obviously bearings in, we just got the cam put in. We're going to put on this thrust plate cover because it's got the new gasket, and then we can start putting the lifters and stuff like that back in.
Alright, now that we got the pistons in, crank in, cams in, we're going to work on getting the lifters and lifter trays put in. This is the active fuel management one, so we do have the different lifters for the various cylinders, so you want to make sure that you get those put in the right spot.
Jack it up.
With the lifters installed now, we're going to take our cloth wheel here and we're going to go through and clean up the heads. We've sprayed them down with some WD-40. We're going to razor blade them just to get all the junk off them so that we have nice clean surfaces to match up with the head gaskets. With the head now set on the engine, we can go through and put all the head bolts back into the engine and start getting those torqued down to their specifications. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put all the push rods in there, and we're also going to put the rockers on as well. Going to use some assembly lube on each of those. That way everything is nice and lubricated when it gets fired up. With those torqued down by the Ryobi impact, we can go through and actually set the actual torque spec on those with the torque wrench. And the last thing to do to finish up this side is to put the valve cover on it again. Now we can get started on the passenger side. We're going to do the same thing with this one, where we're going to put the WD-40 on it. We'll get out our little cloth wheel. We'll scrape the head, that way we get all the junk off of it and get it cleaned and as polished up, as shiny as we can get it. Alright, now that we got that finished up, we can put that on the engine as well. We'll go through and start putting the head bolts back in it, and then start getting these torqued down to spec as well. Alright, with the last of the head bolts getting torqued down, we can now work on putting the push rods in on the passenger side, along with the rockers as well. After getting the rockers initially torqued down with the impact, we're going to go through and actually set the actual torque on them to what they should be. Now we can put on the final valve cover, but something I didn't notice when I took it apart, there was no gasket on the passenger side. Luckily, I keep spare gaskets around for the LS engines, so I was able to get that put on with a new gasket. Next thing that we're going to do is put on the valley cover again. I just went through and hit it with some brake clean to clean everything off. Make sure that all the surface contacts where it's going to touch the motor is clean. That way there's no leakage. Next thing that we're going to do after that is we're going to get the 4 bolts put in the oil pump. After that, we're going to replace the gasket on the front cover and reinstall the front cover. You don't want to tighten these down until you have all the bolts in and have the gasket seated where you want it to go. At that point, then you can go through and actually tighten them down. Next thing that I'm working on is getting the rear cover put on, which is kind of a pain doing it on the engine stand because you don't have a whole lot of clearance on the back of the engine between the engine stand and the engine. Now that we got that done, we can flip it over and we can clean up the bottom of the block to make sure that the oil pan gasket is going to fit like it needs to be, and to make sure that we have all the bolts put in the proper places for the windage tray. On the factory oil pans, they rivet the gasket to the bottom of the oil pan. So when you go to replace the gasket, you actually have to drill out the rivets that are in the oil pan. After getting the old gasket removed, we take a razor blade to clean up the edges, and we try and clean as much of the gunk out of the inside of the oil pan as we can. After spending about a half hour cleaning the oil pan, we go through and put it on the engine and then start reinstalling all the bolts to hold it in place. Next thing that we're going to do is put the balancer on, get that put in place, and then once that is done, then the only last thing that we have to do is put a new oil filter on it. And this engine is done. I want to give a thank you to everybody who watched this video. Don't forget to hit the like button if you liked it. Don't forget to subscribe for more notifications on when content comes out. Have a good one.